Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Pavel Balabanov. I'm the head of therapies for neurological and psychiatric disorders here at the EMA. And it is my pleasure to welcome representatives from patients and healthcare professional organizations, learned societies, regulators and other health-related decision makers, academia and industry to this important multi-stakeholder event on psychedelics. The development of safe and effective psychedelic medicines is a complex process that requires ongoing collaboration. This workshop will offer a platform for all stakeholders to engage in dialogue, exchange information, and collaborate towards this goal. The participation of international regulators also provides a unique opportunity for all of you to understand the global challenges and opportunities associated with the development of safe and effective psychedelic medicines to improve public health outcomes. We know that mental health is a significant public health concern, with more than 1 in 6 individuals in the EU that are affected. The impact goes well beyond the individual, with profound societal implications, and the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this situation with compounding effects of health and socioeconomic consequences to mental health conditions. Although there has been significant progress in understanding the underlying causes of many mental health conditions over the past decade, there is still room for innovation in this field. While there remains the need for more treatments that are safe, effective, and personalized to patients, it is essential that the development of psychedelics takes into account the current European regulatory framework. In recent years, there has been notable increase in research exploring the use of psychedelics in addressing several mental health conditions, such as treatment-resistant depression, substance abuse, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Furthermore, studies such as those funded by the EU's Horizon Europe program are investigating the potential of psychedelic-associated therapy to treat mental health conditions such as psychological distress in patients with progressive incurable diseases who are in need of palliative care. The regulatory ecosystem is also evolving. This is exemplified by the FDA's designation of psilocybin and MDMA as breakthrough therapies and the establishment of a regulatory framework by the TGA in Australia, allowing authorized psychiatrists to prescribe MDMA for the treatment of PTSD and psilocybin for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. However, there is still more work to be done. As is the case for all products that show therapeutic potential, our approach is founded on a balanced perspective between grounded in evidence-based assessment and informed discourse. The development of psychedelic medicines should adhere to the current European regulatory framework at both pan-European and local member state level. To ensure this compliance, it is imperative that developers understand and thoroughly apply the regulatory guidance and requirements that are in place. Moreover, developing psychedelic medicines presents with unique challenges due to their specific characteristics. We must carefully consider the types of data that will be required to support marketing authorization applications, given these challenges associated with the design, conduct, and interpretation of the results from clinical trials in psychedelics. We also need to consider potential challenges associated with the use of psychedelics in clinical practice. This includes determining appropriate and controlled settings for that use, as well as the potential integration of psychotherapy to ensure that they can be used safely and effectively for the needs of the patients. Other critical aspects also include restrictions of the production and supply of those substances due to their classification as controlled substances and the use of health technology assessment to determine their cost effectiveness for the reimbursement at national level. At the EMA, we are committed to provide support and guidance to developers of psychedelic medicines to ensure that they can meet the necessary criteria for safety, efficacy, and quality, ultimately improving patient outcomes. Through this workshop, we aim to foster an environment of open dialogue, active listening, and collaboration with all stakeholders so we can address all these points. Our goal is to support the development of psychedelic medicines by cultivating a comprehensive understanding of stakeholders' perspectives on psychedelics' therapeutic potential, clarifying the existing evidence base for the safety and efficacy of those psychedelic medicines, recognizing both the scientific and practical challenges and promoting ways to overcome them, and identifying the anticipated constraints in the regulatory process and finding the corresponding interventions to mitigate this impact. It is important to understand that today's workshop is a critical step towards creating awareness on how the current European regulatory framework can be applied to support the research, development, and accessibility of psychedelic medicines to ultimately improve public health outcomes. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, our executive director is not able to be present in person here, but she sent her support. And our chief medical officer is trying to attend the meeting online also due to last-minute changes. Both send their apologies and best wishes for the workshop. And after this short introduction, I suggest that we move to the objectives of the workshop and to the first session. While we're waiting to see the objectives, a few practical notes which are important for both the participants online and the participants in the room. As you can see, each of you has a microphone, and to activate it, you have a button. The moment you activate your mic, the camera will focus on you. Please do not forget that this is broadcast, so switch off your mic after you're speaking, otherwise the camera will be trying to focus on different sections of the meeting. Second, please use your virtual hand if you're online and you want to ask a question in the room. You can raise your hand. Very importantly, also for the broadcast, but also and in the room, when you're asking a question or making a point, introduce yourself with your affiliation so people know who you are and who you're representing. And be aware, of course, that this is recorded and broadcast and will be publicly available for our viewers. Thank you very much. Now, as you can see on screen, this is another reiteration of the multi-stakeholder event objectives. And you see also from the agenda that this is an event which we have designed to be a collaborative event in nature. We have tried to have extremely focused presentations by our distinguished presenters, which we have then supplemented with no less distinguished panelists. And we have provided a significant amount of time for discussion. So each session will be organized in two sets. For the first, you're going to hear a number of presentations by the presenters at this row. That will be followed by a session where we'll take questions from the audience, both online and in the room. And then a separate discussion session of more than an hour where the panelists, the presenters, and everyone in the room and online can discuss questions, and we'll try to provide the best opportunity for dialogue in these sessions. This is true also for the sessions that will be coming on the second day of the meeting. I have also the honor of chairing the first session, and without further ado, I'd like to start with this. This session is one that is intended to set the scene and provide some basic positions from a variety of worldwide regulators, patients, experts, and academia, so that we lead from there on into our discussion. And the presentations in the session will address different aspects of the understanding of the bottlenecks, the problem, but also the opportunities as presented by our colleagues from as I said, worldwide regulators, academia, and patient organizations. The first presenter in this session, if I can ask Dr. Mario Haverkamp, who is representing the BfArM. This is the German authority, but also she is a member of our Central Nervous System Working Party and author of several guidelines, and she is here to present the European regulatory perspective. Dr. Haverkamp.
Yes. So, yeah, here's my presentation. So thank you very much, Pavel, for this nice introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor and pleasure for me to present you a European regulatory perspective on psychedelic drugs in psychiatry. Before I start, 3 introductory comments. First of all, I refer to psychedelic drugs. We all know that this is a heterogeneous group of medicines. So we do have the classical psychedelics like psilocybin, but we do also have the non-classical, like more the hallucinogenic compounds and dissociative compounds like ketamine, esketamine, and the entactogens like MMDA. So it's used here in an overarching manner. And I do have only 10 minutes time, so I will focus on a very high level overview, and I will concentrate on the clinical aspects. Okay, let's see if this works. So this is my declaration of interest. I do not have any conflicts. And this is the content. So I will focus on a regulatory clinical background, high level, and on the main scientific and regulatory challenges for psychedelics, and touch upon the other topics you see on this slide, concluding what can be offered by the European regulatory framework, and also some final questions. We are all aware of the unmet medical need, as Pavel just introduced, and the increasing interest in psychedelic drugs. This is just to highlight that the major depressive disorders is the leading cause of disability worldwide, and there had been a sharp increase, as already mentioned, of mental diseases due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this scenario, we have the evolving landscape of psychedelic research. So starting in 1938 in last century with Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD. And then we had a couple of decades with societal and clinical experiments, which culminated in 1971 in the war on drugs, coined by President Richard Nixon, and the UN schedules, where the psychedelics were then put into in the Annex 1 of those schedules as forbidden drugs. And then we had this huge hiatus of 20 years where nothing happened. And in the 19s, slowly, research took up again. And in the 2010s, starting with the psychedelics took flight with lots of developments, lots of studies going on. And we now have also the Horizon Europe project, a 6.5 million euro program where the EU funds the first psychedelic study in patients with incurable diseases like COPD, MS, ALS, and atypical Parkinson's disease. So we are coming from doesn't work, doesn't go on. Next slide. Yeah, now it comes. So we are coming from stigmatization to expectation. And the next slide also shows, going back, this shows also the sharp increase of EU clinical trials for various CNS conditions in the last 13 months. So it's almost a doubling. And thank you very much to my colleague George Eisleitner, who is online, who helped me with this slide. And so doubling. And in this situation, I think we need some regulation. And the recent activities from EU regulators is captured on the following, on this slide, where we have the publications and conferences. We had in the last year, we had a publication on the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, the European regulatory perspective in the Lancet, together with EMA, CNS Working Party members, and also the ENCP colleagues. And we had then the ECNP New Frontiers meeting in Nice in March 2023, where we had a regulatory session, also FDA participation and EMA participation. And there was, as a result, a publication on the knowledge gaps in psychedelic medicalization just published early this year. And there's also a publication on clinical studies and regulatory aspects, as well as one on non-clinical aspects and imaging aspects. We had a regulatory workshop on the Insight conference in Berlin in August last year. And last but not least, we published the revision 3 of the EMA depression guideline in September last year, which was open for public consultation till end of March, and also a publication on this in the European Psychiatry Journal. This is the updated EMA draft depression guideline. So it was 10 years since the last updates due to the Brexit, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but finally we made it and we had lots of new things to take on board. Also a section on rapid-acting antidepressants based on what we have learned from approving Spravato as ketamine for treatment-resistant depression. And then we thought it was timely to put in a section also on psychedelics, although we do not have an approved drug yet, but we have some thinkings along the lines of scientific advices, and we put our first thinkings as a first step into this guideline, a slightly different approach than the FDA took it, but it's a first step forward. Saying this means that also other guidelines might be affected by this, where developments are ongoing with psychedelics. For example, the generalized anxiety disorder guideline or alcohol dependence guideline or guideline on medicinal products for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And here there was a publication by the press that also already the FDA accepted a review of MMDA for PTSD. So very exciting times. Scientific and regulatory challenges for psychedelics need to be addressed. And this is a slide on the types of challenges we do have. We have all kinds of challenges, legal, obstacles from implementation in the EU with the laws and the regulatory fine-tuning, but I focus here on the scientific aspects, which are also addressed in the depression guideline. So the main statements in the introductory part of this section on psychedelics in the guidelines say that we treat psychedelics as all other drugs which are developed for a certain disease. And in the case of major depressive disorder, a positive benefit risk needs to be established. And for this, we need randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled short-term trials, as well as trials to determine the maintenance of effect. So, and due to the safety profile and challenging study setup and execution, it is recommended to start development in a more severely affected populations, such as patients with treatment-resistant depression. We might discuss about that. And now I come to the main challenges which are mentioned in the guideline, and I can only just allude to them because we will discuss these on the during the workshop. So there's, of course, this issue on the comparator, the most appropriate one. Can we use placebo? And there might be unblinding. And how can we do this with maintaining the double blind? We had some learnings from the esketamine development programs, where there were also some kind or danger of unblinding, but this was quite nicely managed in these studies. Attached to this is the expectancy bias, positive and negative, and the possible nocebo effect as soon as patients are aware of what drugs they are getting. And the means that are addressed in the guideline to address this are the low dose or the active placebo, which might be taken into account, but also other possibilities are there. For example, dose finding studies, various doses as one of the pivotal trials that can be used in a program. And this is just what I mentioned, the dose finding and the justification of the adequate therapeutic dose is crucial. Does it need to be individualized? We have to learn about that. Or is it a standard medication scheme? The maintenance of effect needs to be addressed, and there's a little bit of semantics around maintenance. So as well, we need to address the maintenance during the session. How long does the effect last? But also, and above all, the endurance during the depressive episode and the need for recurrent dosing. We need some information on that. How long does the effect last in the episode, and when do we need retreatment? And then the large subject of psychotherapy and psychological support as an integral part of the therapy. Is it really an integral part of the therapy? Is it used for safety reasons, or is it used for efficacy? In the first case, it's more easy to address by the regulators, since we don't regulate psychotherapy. That we have to say only the set and setting in which a drug is applied and be approved drugs. And the set and setting and the training need to be standardized and well characterized, and there needs to be a justification for that. And of course, the safety aspects. We do not know so much about how patients with certain psychiatric diseases react, anxiety with derealization, negative trips. Some medicinal products might have also a potential for addiction, not all of them, but some of them. And of course, cardiovascular side effects. So all this needs to be addressed. And there also are HTA and post-approval considerations, but these are not addressed in the regulatory guidelines. This is something which has to be addressed post-approval. So how can we regulate psychedelics? We do have some means to do this. As with all other medications, we need the establishment of a positive benefit-risk balance. The phase 2 studies that were published, for example, in major depressive disorder, are very, very exciting, very thrilling, and but they are also, some aspects are also sobering about the long-lasting effects, and therefore it was concluded also in these publications that longer and larger trials are needed, and we are very sympathetic with this. The combination with psychological support and our psychotherapy is also a means to control and regulate the psychedelics, and depending on the mechanism of action, safety and the potential for addiction should be carefully evaluated. The tools we do have are, of course, the SMPC, the risk management plan, post-authorization safety studies, which could address certain aspects which cannot be regulated within the first pivotal studies. We might need additional risk minimization measures, for example, educational materials, training materials, controlled access programs, as we also had it with Spravato. As you can see on the right side, some guidelines how to deal with these products. And of course, the legal status would be a means to regulate these drugs. The restricted medical prescription, for example, indicating that it should only be prescribed by physicians experienced in psychedelic-assisted therapy. That could be an example. So, let's see. Okay, what can be offered by the regulators? We do have several platforms. Of course, at very early steps, the Innovation Task Force for very new developments. We do have the Scientific Advice Working Party, and there's luckily already good involvement with developers who develop products for psychedelic therapies. We do have the tool of specific qualification procedures within the SOP on assessment instruments, methods, and study design. We offer consultations in parallel with HTA. EMA has a tool for that. And we have, of course, the regulatory guidelines, which are constantly adapted, and the new clinical trials regulation. So this is already going to the end of my presentation, conclusions with a view to the futures. Psychedelics need to be regulated according to general standards for drug approval, and the field is dynamic, as we all know, and constantly evolving. Regulatory guidelines are constantly adapted and might be helpful, and if scientifically reasonable. Appropriate risk evaluation and mitigation strategies supported by data need to be developed, and scientific advice and early dialogue is recommended and is probably helpful. And this leads over to some questions which I am personally interested in. The first is a scientific question, probably very scientific, because what is the interest of my personal interest is do we can achieve to develop 5-HTA receptor agonists without eliciting hallucinations? Is the subjective experience needed for the therapeutic benefit, and to what extent? This is something which is also discussed in the scientific literature and quite interesting. And then more or less for the regulatory questions for this workshop, the questions are not in and are not coming. I'm just seeing, but then I will give it to you by heart. So the question I would be interested in the depression guideline, we recommend to start in a more severely affected population. So it is not a first-line approach for major depressive disorder, but a second-line approach for treatment-resistant depression, like Spravato did it. Is this reasonable? Is this useful, or should we be more open here? And the second question I do have is a question on the psychotherapy and the psychological support. In how far do we need this? Is it for safety reasons, or is it for efficacy as well? And do we then need to disentangle the effect of psychotherapy from the medical treatment? And that's my my end, and I thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Haberkamp, for highlighting not only the scientific and regulatory challenges, but also highlighting the way we can support from the European perspective the development and probably help to overcome those. The questions we'll save and definitely come back to that in the open session. But now it's going to be interesting also to see whether any of those or most of those, hopefully, challenges are also shared by other regulatory regions. And for that, we should have connecting from the far end of the world in a very late time, Professor Langham. Professor Lobin Langham is the Chief Medical Advisor at the Therapeutic Goods Administration of Australia. Welcome. We know it's quite late with you. Professor Langham is going to present on the perspective from the position of a pioneer. As you've heard in my opening notes, they were the first to adapt a regulatory framework for the use of those drugs, even though not through regulation and authorization, but through authorizing specialized clinicians and physicians to use certain drugs for certain conditions. And we're just waiting for a thumbs up to see whether everything is all right with the connection. Yes, Professor Langham, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for the kind invitation to speak. Greetings from Australia. It is evening here, but nonetheless, I'm very pleased to be able to share with you the experience that we've had in Australia. And thank you to my co-speaker. You've set the stage nicely for us in the sense of this is the sorts of challenges that we're also facing here. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm starting with my summarising slide, and that's because our experience has led us to the point where we really needed to spell this out to a lot of people in Australia, let alone the rest of the world. The first point is therefore, I'm going to talk about that first, and that is how the downscheduling or the rescheduling of 2 drugs for specific indications allowed access to it under a prescribing pathway. And that happened as of July the 1st last year. This allowed access by experienced psychiatrists under prescription, noting that there are several other restrictions that are in place in order to safeguard the use. The other really important thing that I think was misunderstood, certainly in Australia and in the media, and put the TGA at the centre of a huge maelstrom of criticism, and that is that MDMA and psilocybin are definitely not registered. They've not been through that very rigid process that we have in place, like other regulators around the world, of ensuring that we have drugs that are of high safety, quality and efficacy. These drugs are being prescribed through an unapproved goods pathway, and the one that's been mentioned already is the authorised prescriber pathway. If I could have the next slide, please. So this is our scheduling policy framework. Sorry, my husband's just calling me. I'll hang up on him. This is our scheduling policy framework. Right at the top is the drugs that are, or substances that are absolutely prohibited for sale, use and supply. And down the bottom are 3 grades of different access to drugs, one under prescription, one under pharmacist only behind the counter, and one pharmacy medicines in front of the counter, if you like. The 3 light purple ones are really just poisons ones. And the 2 schedules of importance for my discussion today is Schedule 8 and Schedule 9. And if you just click, you'll see the next, advance that slide. There we are. That psychedelics actually lived here in Schedule 9, which are prohibited substances. Next slide, please. So click again. For both Schedule 8 and Schedule 9, you can see down the bottom that the substance is in, both of these substances are included in Schedule 1 or 2 of the UN Single Convention on Narcotics, or in Schedule 2 and 3 of the UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances. So both 8 and 9 comprise those regulations. The interesting thing, the important thing, I guess, about Schedule 9 factors, and I've tried to bold there in the first line, that the substance in to be a Schedule 9 has no currently established therapeutic value. And if you click again, you'll see the difference in Schedule 8 factors is that the substance has an established therapeutic value, but its use at established therapeutic dosage levels is recognised to produce dependency with a high propensity for misuse, abuse or illicit use. By moving it from 9 into 8, that allowed access as an unregistered product in Australia. And if you click the next slide, we advance. The process by which this decision was made happened over about a 2-year period in Australia. I should point out also, I tend to spend a lot of time talking about the drugs, and clearly any use of these drugs has to be with a psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and that is the whole package that we approved, and not just the drugs on their own. There were 2 applications by an independent body to our scheduling committee to downschedule it. There were over 13,000 public submissions. We have an advisory committee on medicine scheduling that met twice to consider this. There was an independent expert panel report, which is now a couple of years old. And there were 2 early decisions not to reschedule that were made in the course of these applications. There was a further public consultation, and then it was really following the most recent publication on psilocybin for the treatment of major depression in NEJM of November 2022 that led to the final decision, which was to downschedule MDMA and psilocybin for the treatment of PTSD and treatment-resistant depression, respectively, in association with the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy on the 3rd of February. And this was really done, I guess, with some reassurance of other controls that would sit around its use. And the final decision and the restrictions and the controls were certainly much more rigid than the original application. Next slide, please. So this is the authorised prescriber scheme that once you have a drug that's sitting in Schedule 8 is able to be used. And under the authorised prescriber scheme, the TGA is able to grant a medical practitioner authority to use a specific unapproved medicine for particular indications to a class of patient in their immediate care. And in order to become an authorised prescriber, a medical practitioner really has to first obtain approval from an ethics committee to prescribe the product under a protocol, and that protocol includes a full consenting process. The reason that it sits with an ethics committee, I guess, is that the ethics committees are often evaluating and approving the clinical trial situation, which is really just Schedule 9, and this is now that next step down with a similar approach to ensure that you have expertise and full consent and awareness of the different responsibilities. So once a medical practitioner becomes an authorised prescriber, they only report to the TGA the number of patients that they treat with the unapproved product twice a year, and they also must report on adverse events. And there's no application fee for this. Next slide, please. So what controls were put in place? Well, specifically, I think, as we've already mentioned, only Australian registered psychiatrists who are fellows of the Royal Australian New Zealand Psychiatry with relevant experience could apply to be an authorised prescriber. That approval from the Human Research and Ethics Committee was next, and that included a clinical protocol that really aligned with those from published studies, with the really robust inclusion-exclusion processes and all safety processes in place as well. Importantly, and this had to do with the authorised prescriber, that the patient has to be under their care, was that the psychiatrist had to demonstrate a therapeutic relationship with the patient. This was not the sort of process whereby one psychiatrist in a very large practice could be the authorised prescriber and everybody else could just get the drug whenever they wanted to. It was actually for the authorised prescriber who was experienced and part of the treating team to have access to this drug. There was also restrictions on the makeup of the remainder of the clinical team. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but it has to do with this sort of awkward, itchy overlap into clinical processes that we don't regulate, and how we work to ensure that at least the clinicians were under an appropriate regulatory oversight. The final step is to be authorised by the TGA to be an authorised prescriber. We encourage, in fact, it is the responsibility of an authorised prescriber to ensure that the use of all products that are registered on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods have been considered as not suitable. So these really are used as once all other registered drugs have been considered. And the TGA also determines whether there are emerging safety concerns that would make approval or endorsement inappropriate. And we also determine whether all of it's sort of like a second checking step on all the other requirements for authorisation. And the last step is an interesting one that we struggle with in Australia, and that is the difficulty in that our states and territories often have different requirements, and they particularly will look at different requirements about possession and supply. Next slide, please. And this was really just talking about how we obtain, so how the authorised prescriber would obtain psilocybin and MDMA, that little graphic there. Every different colour is a different state, and every different state has their own jurisdictional laws to do with this. So it was very important for the authorised prescriber to be able to comply. And just by example, New South Wales, which is one of the green ones, the smaller green one, their jurisdiction was quite clear in that this was only a procedure that could happen only in private hospitals, whereas Victoria, which is my state, the little yellow one to the south, they're happy for this to happen, again, very, very highly supervised, but more in a day hospital procedure. So as well, there was other restrictions on manufacture, on possession, on supply, and all of the restrictions and requirements of the Commonwealth and state territory needed to be adhered to, so that there wasn't a risk of being prohibited under the Commonwealth Criminal Code. It was really important for everyone dealing with this, and again, this was a challenge with the media and the interest that it generated, which was that clearly that possession of the substances without authority was still illegal. That for other indications, they still remained in Section 9, which is prohibited substances and for clinical trials only, and that approval was not granted for protocols which enabled the patient to be dispensed medicines containing these substances to take home, that this was a very strictly regulated in-hospital procedure that occurred alongside the psychotherapy. Next slide, please. The responsibilities I've mentioned briefly, because this is something outside of what the TGA's responsibilities are in ensuring that safety, quality and efficacy, this then falls to the medical practitioner in terms of their responsibility. So they really need to remain informed about changes to benefits and risks as they arise. They do have to consider the potential benefits and risks of the unapproved drug for each patient they prescribe for, and that is where the written informed consent comes into play. They also need to arrange for supply of the goods directly through a sponsor or a pharmacy. And in order to do that, particularly if importation is the case, they do need a licence from the Office of Drug Control, which is part of our Health Products Regulatory Group. And the notion of having to be sort of in a therapeutic relationship with the patient is part of that monitoring of the patient during and after. The 6 monthly reports, I think I've already mentioned, we've had one period of reporting to the end of 2023. Our next 6 monthly period of reporting is coming up. And as I've mentioned, adverse events need to be reported, and any other conditions, and the state and territory legislation right at the bottom there. Next slide, please. The clinical guidance was the really difficult thing, and the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, if you just click again, you'll see an example, and this is something that's freely available on the college's website, which is a clinical memorandum which is for therapeutic use in these cases. And it actually goes into much more detail in terms of what clinical indications and what data should be collected, and the delivery and certain features. This was not part of the authorised prescriber regulations, but this was more of a guidance document from the college, which was very helpful to the psychiatrists that were moving into this field. Next slide, please. Advertising controls are still very important to the TGA. We still have control over this, and that is that any advertising directly to the public is prohibited by law. And the authorised prescribers especially cannot advertise that they are a clinician that is authorised to prescribe this. They may advertise to health professionals, but that they need to be able to do this in a way that prevents access to the public. And information can be provided by a health practitioner to a patient during consultation or treatment, and that itself is not subject to the advertising rules. But it's very important. It's something we stress to our practitioners, and something that we had to re-stress again when the public announcement through media of the first patient that was treated was made by one of the authorised prescribers, which was definitely contrary to the advertising rules. If you are presenting factual, balanced information about the drugs at a medical conference, it's unlikely to be considered advertising, but it really does depend on the context of the presentation. Next slide, please. Authorised prescriber reporting to date. Well, as of today, we have 9 individual psychiatrists who have approved. That's out of, I think, 17,000 psychiatrists, registered psychiatrists in Australia. 3 of them are registered just for MDMA use in PTSD with psychotherapy, and 3 for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression with psychotherapy, and 3 of them are authorised to do both. Next slide, please. This is sort of one of the pleas that we still make to the community as a whole, the academic community and the clinical community in Australia, is that clinical trials still do need to continue, and that's especially for all of the other indications. And we have our ongoing Schedule 9 CTN pathways that allow us to receive a notification, and the HREC still review the scientific validity of trial design before approval, and they also monitor trial conduct. And that's, this has been the case and still is the case, that substances that are being imported or used for the trial will still require approval, import permit from the TGA and the ODC. There's just a list of some of the trials that are still being conducted here and obviously globally. I didn't want to dwell on any of the science behind this, just really look at this from a regulatory perspective. I think the next slide is the last slide. These are, we've got an awful lot of information that is sitting on our resources. We have an MDMA and psilocybin hub. There's an email there if you want to contact any of our team that are very deeply involved in authorised prescriber approval and monitoring of the therapeutic processes in Australia. That's all I've got to say. Thank you very much for asking me to talk. I'll be quiet now, and I'm really looking forward to hearing words from the rest of you.
Thank you very much. You can hear the applause, Professor Langham. I'm sure that everyone will be following up on the results you're going to see from this experience in real world, and this will be very valuable for patients, clinicians, and everyone. So thank you for presenting this. Moving on to another regulatory perspective, I'd like to present to you Dr. Marta Sokolowska, who is the Deputy Director for Centers for Substance and Behavioral Health at the FDA, and hopefully we'll hear if the FDA shares or maybe has some ideas on how to overcome these common problems. Thank you.
For success. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for including the US perspective or the FDA perspective into this very important discussion. Addressing, I have no conflict of interest, addressing mental health disorders, for example, by supporting development of new treatments, including psychedelics, is a very critical priority for the FDA, as these disorders really have great impact on US populations. Just very briefly, few statistics. According to the US Center for Health Statistics, in 2022, we had about 57.2 million doctor's visits with mental health disorders as a primary diagnosis. We have about 5% of adult populations aged 18 and older who report regular feelings of depression. 12.5% report regular feelings of anxiety and worry, nervousness. And tragically, we have over 48,000 of people who report the reports of deaths by suicide. So clearly a really big issue that we need to try to address. So it's not surprisingly that we are really working on supporting development of new treatment, and we are interested in making sure that as many treatments, including psychedelics, we have on the market. So in this presentation, I'll provide a brief overview of some of the indicators of a growing interest in the development of psychedelics, and as well as some of our recent regulatory actions that help to support that. Next slide. Okay, so regarding the indicators of growing interest, let's start with legislation, both from federal as well as state and local actions. So from federal perspective, I wanted to mention National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year of 2024, which is a large collection of laws that sets out the annual budget and expenditure for U.S. Department of Defense. And you might ask, why am I mentioning this specific act? And the reason for it is that one of the provisions of this act requires the Department of Defense to study the treatment of certain conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD or traumatic brain injury using certain psychedelics, such as MDMA and psilocybin. Interestingly, that provision, did I do something? Okay. This provision also identifies that all military personnel, including active duty service members, should be included in these studies. Moving on to the state and local actions, as you can see in the US map, which is from Psychedelic Alpha, these color codes identifies different actions from states and municipalities or regional activities that enacted, that had legislation related to psychedelics, either enacted legislation, active legislation, or they have failed or inactive legislation related to psychedelics. And you can group them essentially in three buckets. You have legalization or regulation statutes, such as in Oregon or in Colorado. You have decriminalization or reduced penalty type of statutes, which is, for instance, in New Jersey and many cities. Also laws establishing a working group to study medical use of psychedelics, for instance, in Texas or in Washington. So again, it really demonstrates great interest in development of these treatments as potential medications. But now moving on to more, what does it mean for research or for development of new treatments with psychedelics? This graphic represents new psychedelic investigation, new drug applications, so INDs, that have been submitted to the FDA, to the Division of Psychiatry within Center for Drugs, from 2000 to 2021. And as you can see, these represents both commercial and research INDs, but they do not include INDs for substance use disorder treatment. So these are only INDs for psychiatry-related indications. And as you can see, the number of indication of these INDs have been increasing within the last years, and also the proportion of these INDs for psychiatry-related indications have been increasing, which bottom line is that psychedelics applications become a sizable chunk of our overall workload related to psychiatric-related indications. So my last slide, next slide, please. my last slide regarding indicators of interest in development of psychiatric indications is with psychedelics related work is regarding publicly reported breakthrough therapy designations. I emphasize these are publicly reported because FDA does not disclose individual breakthrough therapy designations. However, many companies make the point of making them public. So this is the information that has been made public by these companies through press releases, for example. And as you can see, previous slide. Oh, here you go. As you can see on this slide, since August of 2017 to last month, we have reported 5 breakthrough designations related to psychedelic medication, psychedelic programs. These include studying of drugs such as MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, and the indications that are being studied include post-traumatic stress disorder, treatment-resistant depression, major depression, and general anxiety disorder. I do want to mention, because I didn't clarify it before, what is breakthrough therapy designation? This is a process to expedite development and review of drugs that are indicated to treat serious conditions when preliminary clinical evidence indicates that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement over available therapy. So that's why it might be of quite a lot of interest. One more thing to mention on this slide, you might note, just of note, the first line on the designation, it's the breakthrough designation. It has been in use lately quite a lot, and it's due to the fact that MAPS put out press release congratulating the Lykos colleagues of having the new drug application NDA for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD accepted for review by the FDA. So again, a lot of public interest in this space. Next slide. So now related to specific FDA activities, next slide, please. Just to know that, just as my previous colleague have mentioned, there have been a lot of activities within FDA. We have a lot of questions coming from various sponsors and research groups regarding studying psychedelics. So using all the advice, seeing the convergence of a lot of the advice that we have provided, we have put out a draft guidance on psychedelic drugs, considerations for clinical investigations. It was published in June of last year. And again, just to highlight, as my colleague did, there is no special code of regulation for psychedelic drugs. We are following exactly the same rules and regulations for psychedelic products as for any other drugs. They have to comply with the same regulations. But we do recognize that there are special challenges related to development of psychedelic products, and that's why that advice is being summarized in this document. And this is publicly available, and the link is on the slide for anybody who is interested. I do not have much time to go through all the details of this guidance. Just briefly, it's focusing on 5 sections on chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, followed by preclinical section that needs to be completed as part of this as any other application, and then focus on human studies, including clinical pharmacology, assessment of abuse potential, as well as design of clinical studies. And again, similarly to as my colleague have mentioned earlier, we recognize that there are a number of factors that might complicate efficacy assessments. But despite that, we do need to have adequate, well-controlled studies. We do need to, so we can make valid comparisons, but the questions remain regarding the placebo control, regarding how to reduce potential bias with unblinding. We make a lot of comments regarding monitoring requirements in clinical trials. We actually require 2 monitors to be present during psychedelic sessions, and one of the monitors need to have at least graduate education. We need to have a lot of experience with psychedelic therapies, with psychotherapy, also need to be able to practice independently. Also, In this guidance, we also make some comments regarding additional challenges for how to translate this clinical consideration for real world use. And we use these guidance as a basis for a workshop that was held earlier this year in January. It was run through Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. We took the opportunity to discuss this guidance with members of a community, with researchers, with investigators, as well as industries, to have a better understanding of how to take a lot of the components that we have mentioned in the guidance and further explore it. Again, a lot of the sections will be discussed also later during this workshop. But just wanted to highlight that during this meeting, we also took the time to think about the real world implication. What would happen if these drugs are FDA approved? How is it going to be translated into the real world implications? Because there are a number of questions related to it, partially because it has to be clearly indicated there are areas that FDA regulates and there are areas that FDA does not regulate. So with human drugs, we provide product labeling, monitoring of clinical trials, information on risk evaluation and mitigation strategies to assure safety. However, we do not regulate psychotherapy, and that is one of the big questions. What is the role of psychotherapy in regulation of psychedelics? We do not regulate practice of medicine or monitoring of post-marketing setting. So again, I think it's really critical to make it clear what it is that is within our authority and what is not. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to further questions.
Thank you very much. And just to remind everyone that indeed we're going to have a questions and answer session, but that will not be the only time we can discuss. Later on in the second part, we're going to have a full session where you can ask your questions on any of the presentations or the comments made. Now, after the initial presentation from 3 regulatory regions, we are moving on. And the next important topic, and one of the existing bottlenecks up to now, as we know, was the legal challenges for developing and for using psychedelics in research. And to present whether we are having breakthrough in that and what the future holds, I have now Tadeusz Havrot, who is the founder and executive director at the Psychedelic Access and Research European Alliance. Tadeusz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pavel. And I really want to thank the EMA and maybe especially Stefan Tirstrup for organizing this workshop. And I'm delighted to be here with you today and speaking about the legal status of psychedelics and the impact it has on R&D. So these are my disclosures. And I'll start by saying a couple of words about PAREA that I represent. So PAREA is a membership-based alliance, and it brings already existing organizations representing EU-wide patient organizations, scientific communities, psychedelic foundations, as well as industry partners. And we focus on a future-safe and equitable access to psychedelics within a formal healthcare delivery. So I thought that a good place to start is with this reminder that psychedelics occur in many plants and fungi, and they've been with us for a very long time. Some of them were used by indigenous communities for hundreds or thousands of years, and some other were synthesized in the 20th century and then used by clinicians. But the research stopped with these 3 UN conventions, conventions which control and limit the use of narcotic and psychotropic drugs by virtue of their dangers to health, therapeutic value, and risk of abuse. So psychedelics like LSD, MDMA, or psilocybin are included in the 1971 UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances. And this convention sets out 4 degrees, 4 schedules of control, and psychedelic substances are included in the most restrictive schedule, which says that these are substances presenting a high risk of abuse, posing a particularly serious threat to public health, which are of very little or no therapeutic value. It's not entirely clear why they were put in the most restrictive schedule, but there are reasons to believe that this was not exactly driven by scientific evidence, but more by political motives and prejudices. So before scheduling, there was a mounting evidence on safety and efficacy of LSD and to some degree psilocybin. There was a lot of interest in the 50s and 60s, some promising results, although I think it's worth noting that the scientific standards of last century research don't quite match, of course, today's rigor, but these studies were indeed and these promising results were confirmed in the 21st century. And you can see here, I will be providing various quotes, and not all of them I will mention, but Parea's chair, Professor David Nutt, mentions that this was the worst censorship of any research in the history of the world. And by the way, it's David's birthday today, so what a day to celebrate birthday. So this is what happened post-scheduling in terms of the research. You can see here the number of scientific publications and of course, a significant drop. And I also want to mention that 1 month ago at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs meeting, there were 62 countries who issued a statement calling for the reform of the international drug control system. Mentioning that we should rethink this based on concrete evidence. So in terms of the EU system, the EU doesn't have a separate act which would govern which drugs are illicit and to what degree. So it applies the UN convention, but the EU does have has a number of legislations that are providing overall frames regarding illicit drugs, but the degree of restrictions, kind of more concrete parameters, and this includes therapeutic and scientific use, are set individually by each country. And one thing is clear, and that is that the European provisions regarding Schedule 1 make it substantially more onerous to do research on Schedule 1 substances compared to the lower schedules. So now moving on to barriers. First of all, there is a certain asymmetry because it takes a minimal evidence for substances to be included in the most restrictive schedule, but for them to get out of this schedule, of this kind of a black regulatory hole, we need phase 3 clinical trials data. And as such, the only currently active rescheduling pathway seems to be only through the regulatory approval, through approvals of regulators like FDA, EMA, or TGA. Scheduling also impacts scientific collaboration, which, as we know, is foundational to scientific research. Then large-scale trials with Scheduled 1 substances usually are not paid by public funds, which is why it's mostly industry and private donors that fund this research. So as such, this system favors well-resourced players rather than academic researchers, and let alone indigenous communities. And this leads to patentable and potentially expensive synthetic substances over less expensive naturally occurring generics. And patents make it more complicated for academic researchers to study those products. So this situation skews pharma environment and hinders research breadth. And of course, I'm not necessarily criticizing drug developers here, but really it's a call for a level playing field. Scheduling also affects severely the availability of public funding, which is close to none. We just heard about New Horizon Europe grant, but this is the first grant of this type, really. So there was no public funding before. It also affects research potential and research curiosity, because even if a substance, scheduled substance, will lack obvious medical use, affordable and accessible research can uncover new therapeutic avenues without the need necessarily for the substance to be sold commercially. And we see this, for instance, with DOI. You can see here the quote. So the US DEA currently wants to schedule 2 hallucinogenic compounds which are not scheduled, and one is DOI. This has met with a strong opposition from scientific community, because on one hand, there is little evidence that these drugs possess any public health threat. One of the reasons is that the DOI duration is around 24 hours, but they are really useful for scientific research and study how psychedelics work in the brain through the serotonin 5-HT2 receptors. Then we have bifurcated scheduling. So if a psychedelic receives a hypothetical approval, then very likely only specific forms and methods of use might be reclassified, as we have seen with other similar compounds, and unapproved versions would stay in the same schedule. So in a way, it will be more difficult for scientists to work on an active substance, but they might need to work on a commercially approved variation of it, which is a bit kind of nonsensical situation. Then beyond research, scheduling makes it more difficult for researchers and therapists to give harm reduction advice to people who are determined to seek psychedelic therapy after trials. And it can subject those individuals that may seek potentially the only effective treatment for their intractable conditions to the threat of criminal charges. So, concluding on this part, scheduling is a barrier that hampers research. It also artificially restricts clinical trials enrollment, it stifles competition and innovation, and it inhibits access. And all this is happening amid the worsening mental health crisis that we heard about earlier today. It also breaches the principle of science being independent from political intervention. It puts non-industry scientists at a disadvantage. Rescheduling, on the other hand, would have a very specific effect. It would benefit scientific research, because the law change would have no effect on psychedelics availability or use in a recreational context. And I would be remiss not to mention a few policy recommendations from PAREA on top of kind of scheduling discussions. So in these 2 last slides, I will do that. So we know that we are in a mental health crisis, which is coupled with decades-long innovation stagnation. And to give you an example, in 2022, out of 89 new medicines recommended for approval by EMA, none were addressing mental health conditions, and it was exactly the same situation in 2023. In fact, in the last 3 years, only 1 psychiatric treatment was approved, compared to 68 in oncology, for instance. So what we need is to support and steer innovation towards areas where it can generate the greatest added value, such as mental health. And it's also worth mentioning that only about 1/3 of new drugs approved by FDA and EMA have the high therapeutic value. And surely we can see a lot of promise with psychedelics. However, psychedelic drug developers, especially mainly smaller biotech companies, focus on the US market, and there are no approvals in sight really in the coming years in the EU. So the question is, can we just wait and hope for the best and hope that innovation will come, or should we do something? And we believe at PAREA that to catalyze innovation, to kind of entice both big pharma, smaller biotechs, and also to support academic developers, we need a shift towards a more supportive regulatory framework. And this could encompass incentives such as increasing regulatory data protection periods, enhanced EMA support and better utilization of PRIME, calibrating it to capture better mental health innovation. We've seen there are 5 FDA breakthrough designations. Can we do something in Europe to attract similar incentives? We also need to consider things like accelerated assessments, conditional marketing approvals, adaptive pathways, early access programs, and more downstream, more predictable reimbursement environment. And some additional enablers include creating a European hub for mental health R&D, increasing EU-funded research, a better use of real-world evidence, or increased role of patients and their representatives. And on my last slide, I want to mention that we know that one thing is innovation and a different thing is deploying innovation. So translating clinical trials into routine care in a timely and accessible manner. And this will surely be a challenge for psychedelics in terms of this transition from clinical trials to national healthcare settings, which is why we need a mechanism and a strategic approach and a structured collaboration to build an infrastructure and expertise for safe and equitable access. And at Parea, we believe that we need a pan-European multidisciplinary advisory body or commission on novel therapies to combat the mental health crisis. And this body could establish standards of care and comprehensive frameworks for psychedelic care models, including standards of care, training and licensing requirements, ethical and safety standards. And such a synergistic approach could bring together member states rather than having countries addressing these common issues one by one. And such a collaborative effort could be supported by a EU for Health program project, such as EU-led joint action, a EMA pilot, a subgroup of EU expert group on public health, European mission or partnership or on innovative mental health treatments as part of the next RNI framework program, and a EU high-level conference. And we believe that EMA is ideally positioned to stimulate these efforts, and this workshop is another step in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tadeusz, for highlighting the challenges, but also providing first potential solutions and how to address them. And this is only one of the potential bottlenecks that we face. We also know that in real world, health assessment, price and cost effectiveness will definitely be something we need to focus on. So I'd like to ask our next speaker, Carlos Saborido, who is a health economist working with HTA economic evaluation real world data applied to HTA in the Spanish Ministry of Health, to present a potential view and solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you, Ima, for the invitation and for asking to share our expertise on and experience on Spravato, which is the first drug we approve in Spain. So the title of this small intervention is just what is the challenge of HTA on the current psychedelic issue, but also if we look to the horizon scanning and see all the drugs are coming, it's really something to think about. Because if you remember HTA, we try to find out the value of the drug. It's not only the clinical benefit, which is fine. We see a lot of clinical benefits in most of the trials talking about the psychedelic drugs. But the issue is we need to find the value. And sometimes this is hard to do. So I'm not going to be a pain. So I have only 2 slides, not this one. So this one. Okay, I have this slide and the other one is with reflections, but I'm assuming are not going to be shared until the end. So I'm going just to give a couple of ideas. So just coming back to the value for money I was talking about before that, one of the things we are facing when some evidence coming from clinical trials from the regulatory side coming to our table, if we see Ima sneezing, we got the flu. I mean, the clinical evidence in the framework of a clinical trial sometimes offers a lot of uncertainty. You will know what is that, because we are facing uncertainty every time. And we have identified some of these issues, and I would like to present those in the PICO question form. It's very something we are talking about with the new HTA regulation, so I think it's a good thing. So in terms of population, we have identified that we are facing a lot of issues trying to identify the target population out of the clinical trial. So this is always happen, but with psychedelic drugs is much more present. So we have a population into the clinical trial, but when we face the healthcare setting, we are facing people with not the same characteristics. So it's hard to say if this clinical trial is giving us enough evidence to say it's value for money. I'm going to skip talking about the costs of the drugs, okay? But I'm going to talk about value for money because I think it's something we are not affording today. So the second one is the patient with comorbidity. So we are facing patients with other comorbidities, other drugs, other treatments, other therapies, and I think my previous colleagues speak about the other type of therapies. So this is something we are facing. We need to identify if people is receiving another therapy is something we need to evaluate into the HTA, and sometimes it's very complicated. So the third one is the therapy along with esketamine. I think it's something that has been mentioned. So some people is taking antidepressants and other drugs. So the effect of these psychedelics is not just exactly the same that if you are not taking all other type of drugs. So in the eye of the PICO question, we have identified some issues about the administration. We have been reviewing information saying about if the administration needs to be supervised or not, if the people getting psychedelics need to stay in emergency ward for time or need to be an inpatient, and all these things are resources we need to evaluate when we do our HTA reports. And it's something probably in the clinical trial is not very clear. In the C of the PICO question, there are something, one of the evaluators working in Spain with psychedelics mentioned a week before, and she said, we don't have a clear definition of failure or no response to previous therapies. So when you see the technical description of the drug, you see failure to a second, third therapy, but sometimes it's very difficult to say if there is a failure or not. And probably for the next drugs coming to be evaluated, we need to identify that properly. Also, it had been mentioned about comparators, and we have talked about another type of treatments or therapies. That also is linked to the population issue about we don't identify clearly the target population, or we identify it in the framework of the clinical trial, but it's hard to identify when we talk about our population, at least in Spain, but I think it's something happening in all member states. And finally, about the outcomes. So obviously, there is a lack of definition or a lack of good definition of the clinical significance, and we are struggling with the delta for superiority. This is something coming from the regulatory side, but we are facing also this issue when we evaluate some of the trials. And of course, the follow-up. I think follow-up for relapses, follow-up for another type of adverse events. Again, we need much more clinical trials, but also we need a larger follow-up. And this is linked to something has been mentioned by some of my previous colleagues, which is the real-world evidence. And probably is something we need to discuss later on today. If we need to start with collecting data in a real-world setting, probably before we are doing currently, and also I agree with my my colleagues in terms of we need an early dialogue, but probably a very early dialogue about that. We need a strong framework to get in the value of psychedelic drugs in the treatment of patients and all the indications we have reimbursed today, but all the indications coming on. And finally, in outcomes, the uncertainty about all this long-term course of the disease, which is something we are dealing every day, the uncertainty. And just to finalize my intervention, I would like to visit again the title of this presentation, so the challenge. What is the challenge for the HTA organizations, probably for all of them, but I'm talking about the Spanish framework. I think the challenge is trying to identify the value of using psychedelics. I think the framework, the traditional framework to identify the value of a drug is not going to work. And probably because something mentioned before by Tadeusz, which is if we focus this as a traditional drug and we need to identify every resource we are using with these new psychedelics, probably is not going to be cost effective anymore, because we need special surveillance, more real world data. Probably we need special therapies to be introduced along with the psychedelics. So probably we need to think about a new framework. And in these days of new regulations and pharma packages and things like that, probably we need to think about a sandbox clause in our researches, saying, okay, try to be open-minded and identify new ways of identifying value for psychedelics. And I think that's everything from my side. I would like to go ahead with the two reflections, but would be probably later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saborido, for the very clear and almost a shopping list approach towards the necessities of the HTAs. And I'd like to make a short comment that they're not so different from the ones that we see in the early regulatory stages of approval, but with the very strong and very important flavor of economics in them. So in order to address these, I think it's a very powerful message to all developers, academics, and people who are working in this field to know that they have to think about those challenges very early. And even though most of you probably focusing on authorization, we have to think about access, as access is also very key point. And these are points that you almost, as I said, in a bullet point presentation, you can think and try to see how they can be addressed downstream to make sure that patients get the access. Thank you very much. And now moving to a not less exciting, but a different experience from a national perspective. Again, I'd like to present Dr. Horacek, who is the head of the Department of Psychiatry and Medical Psychology at the Charles University in Prague, who will present to us the national side and the experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to share with you some data on Czech model of psychedelic research. I realize now that I'm very deeply in conflict of interest, because I'm the head of a psychiatric clinic where I teach medical students about psychedelics. I'm head of Center of Advanced Studies of Brain and Consciousness, when we apply and analyze the psilocybin and ketamine data. I'm also the co-owner of the psychedelic clinic, which I will share the data with you today, and I'm also founder of the Czech Psychedelic Research Foundation, which paid almost all our studies. So I am deep in conflict of interest. Sorry for this. So in general. In Czech Republic, people are very enthusiastic about psychedelics and psychedelic research. Psychedelic research has a very long tradition from the late 50s, when Stanislav Grof, which is well known, started with LSD experiments in Czech Republic, and we continue with this research from 90s. We began in 90s in animal studies, then we moved to the human studies on healthy volunteers, and now we almost exclusively conduct the clinical trials on psychedelics. We are also trying to help the general mental health in EU, and we participate on the discussions in European Parliament on the possible role on psychedelics in the pandemics of mental health issues which we are facing now, and it is a very substantial problem. But our current research now is focused on head-to-head comparisons of ketamine and psilocybin. We believe that it's very important to answer the question which of these most popular drug from the field, of the wider field of psychedelics, is more effective in long-term and short-term horizon. So we conducted one study on treatment-resistant depression, comparing psilocybin and ketamine. The second study has a very similar design, ketamine against psilocybin, in oncological patients suffering from comorbid depression. And the newest, both of these studies are approved and ongoing. And the last recently approved study is the Raphael study, which is oriented on patients after myocardial infarction with a cardiac arrest, after cardiac arrest. And the primary objective of this study is the very simple question: if it is possible to enlarge the lumen of cardiac arteries by single administration of psilocybin followed by structured psychotherapy. We have also the new two studies. One is oriented on treatment of PTSD in Ukrainian military personnel by combination of psychotherapy and ketamine, and we also participate in the European Consortium on Palliative Care and Psychedelics. But today I want to share with you the data from Psion Clinic. Psion Clinic we established in 2019 with the idea to try to establish the truly psychedelic approach for mental health within this legal environment, within this legal ecosystem. So there were two aims. First was to be prepared for the moment when psychedelics are legalized and it's possible to use them in a clinical practice. And second, to develop the model practically by the use of ketamine, which is off-label, but it's legal in Czech Republic as in the rest of Europe. So we established this private clinic in 2019. We began with the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in 2020, and from 2021, we had the contract with almost all insurance companies in Czech Republic, because they are now convinced that the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy or ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is effective, and it could shorten the treatment of neurotic and depressive disorders. So the treatment at this clinic is almost exclusively paid by insurance, and our experiences are based on more than 450 patients and more than 750 applications of ketamine in the psychotherapeutical context. So we developed the operationalized psychotherapy. So we have the manual for therapists, because the treatment is off-label. So patients sign the detailed informed consent. We include patients, or we treat patients typically with anxiety and neurotic disorders and with depressions. But the primary aim is to enlarge the diagnostic spectrum according the clinical and scientific relevance. So if there is the scientific evidence which is robust, based on randomized clinical trials, that, for example, for the new diagnosis, it could be effective. So we open the clinic for these diagnoses like borderline disorder, etc. We have the standard playlists, and we have some recommendations for our psychotherapists. The psychotherapists at our clinic has to have the full psychotherapeutical training, typically 5-year lasting from different psychotherapeutical schools. It does not matter, and this full training is followed by shorter training by our staff. We apply ketamine because it's legal and it's possible to apply it off-label orally in doses from 200 to 300 milligrams. Typical beginning dose is 250 milligrams, or we apply ketamine intravenously or intramuscularly. It depends on the concrete clinical situation. We check and we control the clinical efficacy of our treatment by 3 scales: PHQ-9 for depression, GAD-7 for anxiety, and PHQ-15 for somatization. So our treatment is very short. It's quite short, but it's followed by a follow-up period of 6 months. So, how our model of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy or ketamine-assisted psychotherapy looks like. So, the basic model and the essential model for us is the single application of ketamine or other psychedelic, which is preceded by 2 detailed preparatory sessions and 2 integrative sessions. So, 5 contacts with the therapeutical team, and our aim is to utilize this very short focused psychotherapy to make some breakthrough, typically for patients who are not effective or who did not respond to standard psychotherapy. So this is our basic model. In situation where the first administration of ketamine were not effective, for example, due to pharmacokinetics, because in case of orally applied ketamine, the pharmacokinetics is very wide and problematic. So it could be the single infusion could be followed by another one. So that this is the second model. The third model is oriented or is targeting the very problematic patients where we from the beginning plan to apply ketamine 3 times. In this case, there is 2 preparations again, 3 applications of ketamine. So the blue circles on your displays and one integration, and sometimes we also apply ketamine, the racemic ketamine, in depressed patient in the biological antidepressant way. So in this case, the stress on psychotherapy is not so intensive like in the other models. But our clinic is primarily focused on utilizing the ketamine effect in psychotherapy, not on biological treatment of depression. So here are the number of patients which underwent the different treatment regimes. As you can see, the majority of patients were treated with single dose of ketamine. Yes. We include or we invite patients from the mood disorder spectrum, depressive patients with resistant depression or anxiety and neurotic disorders, but we also accept the comorbidities with personality disorders because our experience is very good even in such disorders like borderline. So, and here are the major results. What you can see are the decreases are the depression scale, PHQ-9 on the left, and GAD-7, the anxiety scale on the right. And this slide is on all cases and all ketamine models, but majority of them is the single infusion. What you can see here is the rapid decrease of anxiety and depression after the ketamine assisted psychotherapy, which continues and which sustains during the follow-up period of 6 months. This is something what's different from the biological antidepressant application of ketamine, when the ketamine, the antidepressant effect lasts only up to 7 days, not longer. In combination with psychotherapy, it's really lasting. In the lower figures, you can see the statistics and the statistic significance. If we combine the different models, so the red one is the single application of infusion, and you can see here the general trend that the effect is robust. It's detectable not only after the end of treatment and SION clinic, but also through the 6 months follow-up period. The green one is the standard antidepressant application when is no so intensive stress on psychotherapy, and you can see how rapidly the patients went back to the depressive mood. So it's not lasting. So I think that these data are quite interesting to document how the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy could be included into the healthcare system, and that it's important to utilize not only the biological effect but also the psychological insights which are linked to the ketamine as well as to the other serotonergic hallucinogens. Here, this slide is also quite interesting, I think so, because you can see here in the light blue the distribution of depressivity according to the PHQ-9 scale before treatment in our population, in populational SION clinic, and in deep blue that's after the treatment, after ketamine, and you can see the shift up to the left, up to the non-clinical values of PHQ-9 in the inlay slide, in the inlay figure on the right, you can see the same distributions before the treatment, the blue one, and after 6 months. So that's the results. So to conclude, how to generalize if ketamine is connected? If ketamine is complemented by the proper psychotherapy, not very long lasting but intensive for meetings, it can give acute and long-term effect in the clinical population. We deal with very structured, operationalized form of psychotherapy. The protocol could be individualized according to the needs of our clients, and also according to pharmacokinetics, specifically when ketamine is applied orally. We caught only few side effects with this ketamine treatment in more than 750 applications. We had one hospital admission months after applications due to the stabilization of the condition, and some minor somatic complaints. The problem with ketamine as well as the psilocybin is the blood pressure increase, which is up to 15 up to 15. So it's necessary to investigate, to examine the patients before. So our clinic has also the cardiologist, and all of our patients are investigated also in this way. We have quite strong requirements for the therapists, so we need the full psychotherapeutic training, which is very important due to the risk of transfer adverse effects on the part of the therapist, and some feelings of grandiosity, etc. So it's, I think, quite important. We convinced insurance companies that this way of psychotherapy shortens the total duration of psychotherapy, and that's why they also they cover our treatment. And last but not least, I think that it's very important to use some psychometrics to detect the clinical effect, and I think that this part or this component is essential for the future regulation of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horacek. A very clear example of what can be done in the current framework on a national level, and obviously what challenges you face. Now we can start and actually include everyone in the room and online with the questions and answer session. I'd like to thank all presenters for keeping very strict to the time. So we have the full half an hour for questions and answers.